Hi and welcome to the sew along video for pattern 1801 Vicky's off-shoulder raglan. To make it easier with this sew along, I'm going to assume you only have access to an overlocker and a plain stitch sewing machine. So that's how we're going to finish this garment off. However, if you do have access to a cover stitch to complete the hems, I strongly suggest you use it, or else a twin needle will also be fine. So to get started, this pattern has 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch seam allowances. So make sure your overlocker width is set to 6 mils, 1/4 of an inch, and that you have 4 threads of matching colour in your overlocker spools. When you set up your sewing machine, it's a good idea to make the stitch length longer, and I'm going to set mine to number 4. The garment I'm going to show you how to sew today is the top version with the elongated sleeves, and that's where we're going to start. So when you're ready, get your sleeve pieces and we'll start sewing these on the overlocker. So the version we're sewing today is the statement sleeve version, and it has a seam up the top arm line, which is basically the center of the wrist up to the shoulder point. So for this version, we have 2 sleeves, a front and a back sleeve. You'll tell the difference because the back sleeve has 2 notches on it and the front sleeve has a single notch on it. So to get started sewing this, what we need to do is take the sleeves and place them right sides together. So take one back and one front and place them right sides together. We're going to sew the edge that has the curve in it. When we're sewing raglan sleeves, it's probably more important than any other time to make sure when we sew that the beginning and the end points match perfectly. And especially for this garment that's going to have a neckband around the neck edge, it's going to be very difficult if we don't get the neckline position perfect. So when you're ready, match the beginning of that seam and make sure you just sew a couple of stitches to hold that in position with your overlocker. What that does is it almost works like another pair of hands, and it frees our hands up so we can match the first notch point. Now make sure you rearrange your fabric and any excess fabric can be eased between that point there so we have a nice smooth sewing line. Stop after you've sewn the notch and find the end or the hem position. You'll see another notch just short of the hem position, and that's positioned at 1.5 centimeters, which is 9/16 of an inch. And that will show us the hemline, but more on that later. So for now, just overlock all the way to the edge and then use your scissors or just to trim off the thread. So now just repeat that with the other sleeve. So now's a really good time to sew the hem edge of that sleeve. So if you have a cover stitch machine or prefer to use a twin needle, you can do that now. But what you'll see is at the end we have a notch at the 1.5 centimeters or the 9/16 of an inch position. So that just shows us the turning point. So because I'm going to assume you don't have access to a cover stitch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlock that hem edge right sides up, and then I'm going to move across to my plain sewing machine, the flat stitch machine, and we're going to finish that hem off to mimic the look of a cover stitch machine. Now remember, the cover stitch machine gives us a stretch finish and is the correct machine to use for this type of knit fabric, but a lot of home sewers don't have access to that. So you can use a twin needle in a domestic sewing machine, or because this seam's not going to have any pressure on it, I'm just going to use 2 rows of plain stitching on my sewing machine. The other thing to mention at this point is I have a ball needle in my sewing machine, and a ball needle is really important because it will stop the needle from cutting our fabric. What will happen is if you use a regular needle, the needle will go through and cut the threads, the yarns in our knit fabric, and it may cause a ladder or a run. So the seam we're going to sew is the seam we've just overlocked, and you'll see the notch position at either end of the seam we're going to sew, the hem we're going to sew. So what that means is just here you can see a small notch, and that shows us the turn. Now if you prefer it, go ahead and press that with your iron, or if you're comfortable to just go ahead and sew that, go for it. So what I'm going to do here, because I prefer to sew the first line of the stitching from the wrong side, is I'm going to fold at the 1.5 centimeter mark, and I'm going to stitch a line of stitches directly through my overlocking, because that will hide the stitching line. I'm going to use the thread guides on my needle plate to make sure I have a straight line, and I'm just going to do this by sight. When you approach the intersection of the seam, make sure that that faces towards the back of the garment. So now I'm going to turn the garment over, and I'm going to sew a second line of stitching on the side closest to the fold. Now there's no real need for it, it's just really a decorative top stitch, so it looks like I've used a cover stitch machine. And when I finish that, I'm going to repeat the process on my other sleeve. So sometimes when you're sewing a raglan, all the pieces can look the same and it can get quite confusing. So the easiest way to do it is to take the back piece and sew it to the sleeves first. So you'll know it's a back because there's 2 notches at that angled sleeve position, and there's also, when you open it up, you will see 2 notches at the centre back neck position here. Also generally the back neck of a raglan is higher than the front neck. That's another good way. So when you've opened that back piece up and it's facing right sides up, take one of your sleeves. So the best thing to do is to find the sleeve, double notch. So open up the sleeve that you've just sewn together, and one of the sides will have a double notch on it. So when you find that double notch, match that to the double notch of the back, making sure right sides are together. Before you go any further, just double check you have that in the correct position. If you match the neckline, and remember that neckline needs to start perfectly, it needs to be right on the edge, you'll see a double notch as you go further down there. So when you're ready, present that to your overlocker and just sew a couple of stitches, maybe an inch or so, a couple of centimeters, just to hold that into place. And then find the double notches and make sure the double notches sit directly on top of each other. Then find the end position, match those perfectly. And if you have any fabric that's excess in there, just make sure it's eased between the two positions before cutting that off with either your thread snips or a pair of scissors. So now you've sewn one sleeve into place. Before you go any further, sew the other sleeve into position. So take that other sleeve, find the double notch, and place it right side down. Present that to your sewing machine and just repeat what you did before. Overlock a couple of stitches so that that works like a pair of hands for you. Find the notch position and make sure the double notches are sitting directly on top of each other. Stop, reposition your work, find the end, and overlock and snip your threads. Now, it's a really good idea to position your work the way it was before, with the back in the center and the sleeves on either side. This will make it easier to sew in the front. Take the front piece and place it right side down. So we have right sides together, and you'll know it's the front because up by the neckline there'll be a single notch. So match that sleeve position to one side. So the sleeves are together, and hold that in place with a pin or some other fastening device, and then come to the other side and match the other sleeve into position. And when you know that's in the correct place, take that straight to your overlocker and overlock that together. So what this does is it just stops us getting confused with all those angled edges. Make sure you match the notch as you go, and at the beginning the neckline and the underarm positions are all perfectly together. Now come to that side that had the pin in it, match the raw edges together and overlock that also. Now remember to remove the pin when you're overlocking. If you leave the pin in, you will smash your needles, and no one likes to replace overlocking needles. So make sure you take that pin out. So here is the neckline, and you can tell the back from the front because the front will have a single notch and the back will have a double notch. The front will be lower than the back as well. So rearrange your work without fluffing around too much so that the side seams are sitting on top of each other. So down by the hemline, you'll see a notch which will show us the turn position for the hem, and we're going to sew from the body hem through to the sleeve hem position. What we need to do as we go is make sure our notches match, and that when we get to the underarm position, we want those seams to sit on top of each other as well. So it makes no difference whether you sew from the sleeve hem to the body hem or the body hem to the sleeve hem, it's whichever you prefer. When you're ready, just make sure the beginning and end matches and start overlocking the side seam together. And don't forget to repeat the process for the other side seam. Now, because I overlocked from the body hem to the sleeve hem, now's a really good time because I'm at the sleeve position to put my sleeve hem in, the remaining sleeve hem. If you have a cover stitcher, turn at that 1.5 centimetre, which is 9/16 of an inch position. And if you don't, just go ahead and overlock that for now. And remember to repeat that on the other sleeve. So now we're ready to overlock the neckband together. You will have a mirrored pair of neckbands. Take one neckband and fold it, match the raw edges on the short edge, and overlock that seam together. So that edge is our center back position. When you've done that, repeat it for the other neckband piece. Fold it so that right sides are together, making sure there's no twists, match, and overlock. It's time to sew the neckbands together, right sides together. But we need to make sure that we sew the correct side of the neckband. So let's get started. Right sides together, place one neckband inside the other neckband, making sure those centre back seams are sitting on top of each other. The side we need to sew is the side that curves up. It will have less notches on it. All you will have is the centre back seam and a notch directly opposite the centre back seam, which shows us the centre front. So it's a good idea before you start overlocking that to just hold those two in place. Double check by making sure you hold the neckband like this. We want to sew the uppermost edge, the shorter edge, the curve up edge on top. So when you're ready, overlock that together, and it's a good idea to just start one side of that centre back seam. Now try not to stretch this too much as you overlock, and when you sew over that centre back seam, make sure that the seams face in different directions to help lock that into place. Start by overlocking a few stitches and then just rearrange your work, making sure that centre front notch is in the correct position and sew through. So it's really important not to stretch this too much. Now, if you do stretch this too much, You may need to go ahead and put some clear elastic into that seam afterwards. So you could attach that using a zigzag stitch and make sure you attach that within the overlocking line. So now turn that neckband so that wrong sides are together. So when you're ready, just finger press that neckband so that the seam you've sewn is sitting right on the outside. The heat from your fingers should be enough, but if you prefer, you could go to an iron and press that into position. We're now going to sew the neckband into the garment body. The easiest way to do this is to make sure our garment is inside out and that the back is away from us and the front is towards us. There will be a double notch which shows us the back of the garment. So find the double notch and place the neckband seam, the centre back seam, directly in the middle of that double notch. When you have that in the correct position, fix it with a pin within the seam allowance. Now, as you work your way around the neckband, you will find other notches. So these notches should correspond exactly with the seam they're going to sit on. So the first notch on one side of the back will be the sleeve seam. When you have the sleeve seam sitting exactly on top of the other notches on the neckband, pin that into place and continue around the neckband until all the notches match. When you think you have it pinned in the correct position, just pick it up by the shoulders and give it a little shake and just double check that it all looks right. When you're comfortable that all the notches in the pinning are in the correct position, now's the time to go ahead and overlock this in. It's much easier to check now than to try and unpick your overlocking later. So find the centre back of the neckband and we need to work out the best position to start our overlocking from. In my opinion, you're better off finding the centre back and then starting from the side of this, starting from a shoulder. So the reason I do this is because when your garment's on a hanger, you won't see the ugly beginning and ending of your overlocking thread. However, if you're going to sew a label on, then start from the centre back because your label will hide the beginning and end of your overlocking. So now go ahead and overlock around that neckband edge. Try not to stretch it too much as you go and just remember to remove those pins. Now if you try this on and you have stretched this out too much, you can also put Mobilon on this seam here. So Mobilon is that It's around about a 6mm, 1/4 inch wide clear elastic. You could just zigzag that into position over that overlocking. So the last step in our process is to finish off our hems. The hem position is marked as the notches at 2.5 centimeters, which is 1 inch, and that's for both the top and the dress version. So if you have a cover stitcher, go to it now and stitch that hem in at 2.5 centimeters. If you're following the process I have, just go to your overlocker and overlock the raw edge. Now I'm starting this overlocking from a side seam just to hide the beginning and end a little bit more. So if you come to the side seams, you'll see the notch here. So that shows us the turning point for the hem. That's the position you need to turn your hem up and stitch through the overlocking on. Now, if you'd prefer, go to your iron and press that hem into position before you begin. It might make it easier to sew that. So now I'm going to finish off the sleeve hem first. I'm just going to tuck under the tail of the overlocking before I turn at the 1.5 centimeter position on the sleeve hem. And I'm going to sew this from the wrong side, remembering to back tack at the beginning and end of my seam. And when I reach the intersect point, I want to make sure that that seam faces towards the back. Now the reason I tuck under the end of the overlocking is because if you cut it off directly on the edge of your fabric, it frays back in. So it's easier to leave a small tail, maybe 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters, and just tuck it under in my work. So now I've sewn that sleeve hem, I'm now going to run a second row of stitches parallel to the first, just like we did earlier, just to keep all my work consistent. Now this is purely decorative top stitching, and there's no stress on this seam, so there shouldn't be a problem using a plain stitch. Now using my thread snips, I'm just going to do some QC or quality control work and just tidy up as I go. So go ahead and repeat that for the other remaining sleeve, which is the other remaining sleeve hem. So the last hem we're going to sew now is the body hem. If you have access to a cover stitcher, turn at the notch position, which is 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch, and cover stitch that. If you have access to a domestic machine twin needle, you could do the same. For me, I'm going to sew this on the plain sewing machine, the straight stitch. So the disadvantage of doing it my way is if the seam is under any pressure, say for example when you put the garment on or off, there won't be any give. So this means this seam could snap. If you choose to do that this way, just bear that in mind. So if you're going to sew this with the plain stitcher, turn and sew this from the back of the garment through the overlocking line, making sure any overlocking thread is tucked into the seam allowance, and that when you pass by the side seams, the bulk of the seam faces towards the back of the garment. Remember to back tack at the beginning and end of your stitching. Turn your garment over so the right side is facing up, and starting at the same position you did for the first line of stitching, sew a second line of stitching parallel to the first to mimic the cover stitcher. So that's the end of this sew along video. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to you joining me for my next sew along video soon. Be sure to join up with my Facebook pattern discussion groups for more hints, tips and tutorials for the latest patterns.